On the 21st of March 2024, Professor Daniela Gabor joined the Economics of the Real World panel hosted by Ivan McKee and SCOTONOMICS at Holyrood. Now, Daniela Gabor is Professor of Economics and Microfinance at UWE in Bristol. Now, due to technical difficulties, we could only hear from Daniela for 10 minutes, but what a great 10 minutes it was. Daniela covered several important topics and we were delighted to have the opportunity to bring them to the attention of policymakers in Scotland. Several MSPs, Scotland's chief economists and several invited guests from Civic Scotland were in the audience. My first question to Daniela was, why is it important to understand who creates private money? Here's what she had to say about that.
Why is the question of who can create private money important? And to me it's important because I'm sure you're all aware, and we're all aware if we just look a little bit around us, what is happening at the moment in terms of the historical juncture we're at. We have like these two parallel tensions or developments going on. One is it that political and policy elites in countries in the global north, from the US to the UK to European Union, have now come to an agreement that we need to do industrial policy again, that the state should be in the business of large-scale economic transformation, and I think Scotland is part of that trend. So that's one very significant departure from what we think are the neoliberal ideas of the past several decades. But at the same time, while we recognize that a bigger state is back by necessity because of the nature of the crises that are hitting us, because of the nature of the geopolitical competition that we have, we are not allowed to use the money-creating power of either the state or the private banking system in order to pursue transformative ambitions, right? And think about China for a second. When China said we want to shift out of infrastructure or we want to shift out of housing into clean tech and into particular competing on electric vehicles, what the Chinese state said is like, okay, we will take the institutions that create credit in our economy and we will push credit through the strategic sectors that we want to support in order to make sure that we give them a competitive edge. And to me, this is the important question of who creates money and how, is that if you don't have the money creating power of your commercial banking system at your disposal in order to pursue transformative ambitions, what do you have left? And if you read, for example, Rachel Reeves' speech from 2 days ago, or if you listen to BlackRock, or if you listen to the Biden administration, what they will say, if you don't have the local banking system, what you have is shadow banks. And by shadow banks, I mean institutional cash pools, private equity companies, I mean asset managers, that are managing money on behalf of pension funds, and who come with this idea of a magic money tree. You know, we think about MMT, modern money theory, as if you think it's the left response to how do you create, how do you generate financing for the kind of projects that you want to do through the state. From the shadow banking, we have like the finance-led magic money tree that says, all you need to do is to de-risk, is to mobilize private capital. And the story of mobilizing private capital, attracting private capital, sharing risks, increasing infrastructure investment, increasing investment in nature asset classes, which sometimes, or in carbon offsets, all these are, to me, a reflection of our political inability to basically take back control of the money creation powers of both the state through the relationship between the central bank and the treasury, and of the banking system, which we used to have and we used to deploy more effectively in the past than we do at the moment.
Now, Professor Gabor cut to the chase. The state must have more control or involvement in creating money. It can spend that money into existence or direct commercial banks towards the right type of investment. Unless this happens, governments are forced to turn to shadow banks. Now, much of Daniela's research is on shadow banks, and as we will hear later, she believes there are serious, perhaps grave reasons to limit the involvement of these types of unregulated sources of finance in European countries. Now, Daniela wrote one of the most important opinion pieces during the 2024 general election campaign. Her article states, the Labour Party has a plan for returning to power. It will get BlackRock to rebuild Britain. Check out the article. The link's in the comments below. But let's dig a little deeper into what Daniela says. First, let's look at the UK. Now, as we know, the UK is a currency issuing government and can create money by spending it into existence. The magic money tree, as Daniela refers to it. Now, this is actually a useful metaphor. The UK creates new money out of thin air when it spends. There is a magic money tree. Now, suppose the UK wants to finance, for example, the construction of a new energy company HQ in Aberdeen. It deposits X amount of money in the construction company's bank account to do that. The government directs the resources it needs to build that HQ by issuing that money. It doesn't use taxes or borrow money to do this. It simply types the amount into bank accounts. In a nutshell, this is the magic money tree. It's the power of government money creation. Now, the UK government could also direct private funding to certain types of investment projects as the financial regulator. For example, it could demand that a higher percentage of loans must be made to community energy projects or social enterprises. I think these are the types of investments that Daniela supports. Now, the Scottish Government cannot create currency or regulate private finance. Two exceptionally important economic tools are locked in the Reserve Powers Cabinet. Now, like your local authority or you and me, the Scottish Government is a currency user. We all have to find the money to spend on the things we want. We cannot create that money and then spend it. Financial regulation is not devolved. The UK Government is the only government that can force lenders to direct their investment. We need to clarify clearly the distinct powers of the Scottish and the UK governments. The current SNP administration has struggled to highlight these important differences effectively. Now, the UK chooses not to create money to spend on critical infrastructure and does not direct commercial banks to prioritise investments in certain industries. The Scottish Government is unable to do either of those two things. But two more important points as we consider an independent Scotland. The current administration has suggested that we remain a currency user for likely a decade after a yes vote. Secondly, the economic prospectus for an independent Scotland does not indicate a desire to direct commercial banks in Scotland to fund a just transition or industrial development. Now, following Daniela's lead, these ideas must now form part of the plan for an independent Scotland. Now, as we continued the panel discussion, we covered financial services in a bit more detail. One of the audience members asked why SMEs, small, medium and sized enterprises, were struggling to find finance across the UK. Daniela highlighted this as another example of the role that the state must play in directing resources. It should encourage banks to fund certain types of investments. Here's what Daniela said about that. Oh, and there's also a more general point about how poorly capitalism directs investment towards sectors that promote value.
To me, the question goes back to what kind of economic activities do you want your banking system to be promoting? And are you willing to do the kind of structural reform and regulatory reform that will make lending to SMEs more attractive? And we have had, over the past 15 years, we have had attempts both in the European Union when the UK was in the European Union and less in the UK, to say you want to lend for speculative purposes, we will make it very expensive for you. So you just change, the relative returns that you can get. But again, this goes back to, is the state prepared to take a much stronger role in leading the allocation of economic and financial resources? What we know now is that the markets and capitalism itself cannot indicate to us what value is anymore, in the sense that there are economic activities which are clearly generating profit, but they are also generating climate destruction. Whereas there are economic activities that are not generating a lot of profit, but they have a much higher value in terms of the net zero or the climate transition. And if we look at the question of value from this point of view, that we have to decide that to strand certain assets, to shrink certain economic activities, to promote other economic activities, then the question of it's not just a question of who pays for it and how do we pay for it, but it's a question of how do we organize ourselves as a state with capacity, both technocratic, technical, bureaucratic, and financial capacity to do that. And so this is the uneasy part for me in what I'm going to say, is that I was born in communism in Romania. I lived for 10 years under central planning. It wasn't a very good experience. I came out of it being somewhat reluctant to think that central planning is a way to organize economic activity. But now, the more I study the question of profound transformation and the overlapping crisis that we are in at the moment, the more I think that we need to think very seriously about planning, and not just land planning, but generally in integral systemic planning of economic activity at economy level. And I think there are some small steps that have been taken into that direction. For example, the Bank of England, who we have now spent, I think, for 30 minutes kind of scapegoating in some ways. I think there are some good things that Bank of England has done under Mark Carney, which is to create a framework for decarbonizing their corporate bond portfolio that came very close to what I think could be a novel approach to indicative planning or some form of planning, because it allowed an institution of the state to closely track the economic activities of large corporate issuers, and to say not just the economic activities, but the carbon footprint, and to say, I, the state, am in the business of telling you to shrink this or to increase that. And I think it's important if we want to be serious about triggering large-scale economic transformation.
Policymakers must grasp this fundamentally important point, even those who believe capitalism has been good for Scotland. It's hard to find anyone who would argue right now that capitalism points investment to the sectors that deliver the type of value that we must now strive for. Capital seeks the best return. It has no concept of the true meaning of value. Now, the final point I want to emphasise is Professor Gabor's suggestion that the government should take a stronger role in industrial strategy. This is despite Professor Gabor witnessing the significant failure of communist-led state planning up close. Now, it pains me to point out again that Scotland, as part of the UK, without its own currency, the powers lie in Westminster. Even with independence, this type of industrial strategy is absent from the Scottish Government's economic vision for Scotland. After listening to Daniela's comments, I spotted some themes related to degrowth, so I asked her, is she supportive of the degrowth? Here's what she said.
I'm friends with the degrowth movement, but not. I don't think that it's necessarily a politically useful term to mobilize the kind of changes that we want. So I just want to clarify that. The predicament that Scotland finds itself in is quite not necessarily unique, because other countries have ideological pressures that force them into the same kind of predicament, which is that you have the transformative ambitions, and then there is the macrofinancial constraints are so powerful in some ways that they are very difficult to overcome unless you get very, very, very different kinds of institutions building, and that requires massive upheaval.
It was refreshing to hear throughout Daniela's talk that she referenced the power of institutions. Daniela mentioned the role of institutions such as the central bank, the international finance markets, and money in shaping an economy. Too many economists miss these institutions' central and crucial role in our economy. Now, when we are independent, we must separate ourselves from as many of the current UK institutions as possible if we really want to have more control of our economy and our society. If we want to make Scotland more resilient, this process must start now. Now, there's no denying it, and we should not shy away from the fact, as Daniela says, this will be a massive upheaval. But to fix this mess, this is exactly what we need to do. You have to break some eggs if you want to make an omelette. Back to Daniela as she tackles an area where she has spent considerable time researching, the de-risking of private enterprise by the state.
And I just want to say something about what I've been studying for the last 5 years, which is countries that find themselves in this particular predicament are very tempted to go down the route of what the big finance Wall Street describes as de-risking, which is to say, when we ask ourselves, how do we pay for things, or how do we pay for economic transformation, if we can't say with our fiscal resources, or with public investment, or with some closer coordination between the central bank and the treasury, then the answer is, well, why don't we create partnerships with the people or with the private capital that has the money? And that typically means BlackRock or other large asset managers would come knocking on the doors of politicians and say, look, we have money, we just need to be helped, guided, mobilized, steered into the direction where you want us to go. And that means getting some help from the state. And they use the language of de-risking to explain or to think through this, through how to mobilize, which is to say the state assumes some risk, so it becomes marginally or relatively more profitable for private institutional capital to come in and invest in the kind of things that politicians would like to do on the public balance sheet, but they can't.
There is probably no better way to summarise the current Scottish Government's approach to financing our transition than a desire to de-risk private sector investment. This is termed as a partnership approach. This tries to suck in as much foreign direct investment as possible. More foreign investment is seen as a good thing. It's why there is no concern that a New York private equity firm now owns land purchased with public money via the Scottish Investment Bank. But that investment comes from owning assets and delivering a return. So in the long run, we lose currency and control of vital assets. Now, at the moment, I have sympathy for the Scottish Government. As we have already highlighted, the Scottish Government cannot create this much needed currency, as it's a currency user. So unless it wants to increase taxation in Scotland, it must attract foreign currency. This is the economic reality. However, I cannot understand why we will continue to rely on foreign capital when we are independent. Daniela's outline, I believe, emphasises the need for our own currency on day one of independence. Now, this would enable the Scottish Government to use public money to liberate and direct resources without relying on foreign capital. An independent Scotland must be ready and willing to use the fiscal space and the power available to independent nations by issuing its own currency on day one of independence. Now, Daniela finished her presentation with a warning about welcoming international capital from private equity and international asset managers. Now, I've made some important points for policymakers, but this is the one thing I want our MSPs in Hollywood to really pay attention to. Please listen to the stark warning from someone who grew up in an authoritarian regime in Europe.
Of course, that means redirecting fiscal resources towards financial capital, whether it's not national or foreign owned. And to me, the danger with that is that it's not fast enough, and the justice and the distributional consequences of that are very serious. And with that comes a political backlash that we have already seen in the European Union and on a massive scale. And with that comes the kind of political authoritarianism that frightens me.
This is a reality that other guests on our episodes have warned about, especially Clara Mati. In her book The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism, she clearly connects the dots between fiscal retraction and right-wing regimes. As Professor Gabor highlights, by welcoming and de-risking national and international capital, governments put profit ahead of people, place and planet. Now, this is a huge distributional and justice issue. Daniela's opinion piece in The Guardian shows that just when we need to act with determination and direction, we have a UK Labour government that seeks to hand control over to international private capital. BlackRock will be building Britain, as Professor Gabor wrote. Labour government are so scared of increasing the public balance sheet by spending more government money that they will take an approach that will hamstring our policy responses to the poly crisis for the rest of the decade. In Scotland, our policymakers lack awareness that their strategy of welcoming foreign capital to fund our just transition is similarly doomed to fail. All it will do is increase inequality in Scotland and reduce the amount of wealth held in our communities. Now, unless the current administration listens to economists like Professor Gabor, they will continue to create a framework for an independent Scotland that lacks the ability for Scotland to self-organise and adapt. Now, as we highlighted in our introduction to a resilient economy, the Scottish Government must ensure that power is spread as widely and deeply as possible in Scotland. This is especially true regarding finance and the creation of money. We create a brittle system when we rely on one source of finance. We will only create a resilient, well-being economy if we prioritise justice and efficacy over the efficiency that neoclassical economists have as their only guiding principle. Now, the Scottish Government wants to create a resilient wellbeing economy. My concern is that their policy framework will ensure that this is out of reach, or even worse. Focusing on attracting private investment, retaining this subservient position as a currency user, and lacking the courage to direct private investment when we are independent could lead us to a very dark place. Now, the Scottish Government must listen to our concerns, as Professor Gabor has expressed so concisely. If the current administration is really ready to listen, we await their call. Now, if you wish to help us bring more of these issues to the attention of fellow Scots and policymakers in Holyrood, please share and comment on this video. You can also support us via our Patreon membership site and subscribe to our mailing list, the link's in the comments below. If you want to learn more about Professor Gabor's work on shedding light on shadow banking and de-risking the private sector, check out the links in the comments as well.